Hello everybody and welcome to my secret Scottish lair, located inside a hollowed out volcano on the outskirts of Dundee. I am here to introduce today's video, another entry in my series of A Life in Cars, and today's subject is part-time motoring author and full-time madman Rich Duisberg, who has very kindly agreed to sit down and share some of his experiences as a salesman for quality control products to car factories in the 1990s, where he bore witness to some unbelievable goings-on.
And of course, talking about car factories and things going wrong, Rover was really the place to be. Genuinely don't remember what the incident was that sparked this mutiny, but it was essentially a mutiny. And they pulled a gun, and it's absolutely terrifying.
We also talked about how he became a key member of X-Car in its very early days, the channel that went on to become known as Carfection.
What do you want to just bugger off and leave us alone whilst we do something dodgy for a day?
And, last but not least, his unusual motorsport exploits that have seen him take part in what I think is the world's greatest race, and also how he got himself banned from Hertz. But I am also here to deliver a small warning. Today's video is not family friendly. Some of the topics and language used here are not suited to young viewers. If I were to give this an age rating, I'd say it's about a 15 or 16. Your mileage may vary. They're not my children, it's up to you. But don't say I haven't warned you. Rich was a little bit unsure as to exactly how many of his anecdotes you really wanted to hear, but I assured him it was all of them. Today, you're going to be getting just a small selection, and I know there are many more. So if you've enjoyed this video, please hop into the comments section, tell us how much you've enjoyed it, and don't forget to share it with your friends. And finally, a huge thank you to Stonehurst Family Park for providing the venue for today's video. Let's get on with it, shall we?
I'm Rich Duisberg, and Duisberg's actually a nom de plume. I'd never used my real name because I had quite a respectable day job. And when I started to write about cars and do some slightly saucy things, I thought it would be better to sort of divide my personal and professional life. So I was born in 1972 in the Midlands, and my dad wasn't really into cars. A lot of people get into cars through their father. Dad always had a Cortina, and he would have it new, and he would run it for 2 years. So my dad was a sign writer. He's retired now, or semi-retired, and he does stuff like this, proper old school sign writing, which is great. And as a kid, I thought I would do the same. You know, it's fun to follow in your father's footsteps. And he kind of talked me out of it. I think he saw the world of stickers and cheap printing coming and realised, that the writing was on the wall, really, for sign writers, if you pardon the terrible pun. So he kind of talked me out of it. And I wanted to join the RAF, so I did the Air Cadets thing and went down to Biggin Hill. I wanted to be a pilot. And I passed the tests for all of that, which I was quite pleased of because sort of, working class lad from the Midlands, I hadn't been to university. We cut backs that year, 1990-ish, I think it was, and said, go and get some life experience and come back. And I never did. So my first job, and I've never admitted this before, was cleaning at a petrol station. So my job was clean the toilets, clean the forecourt, clean the pumps. I don't think they trusted me in the shop because it was warm in there and there was chocolate and people to talk to. So I owed my dad some money and he basically said, go and get a job. So I did that for a little while. And I progressed from there to, which wasn't difficult to progress from there, to working for a woodworking company, a very large traditional sort of Victorian engineering business. Working with sort of technical support and spares and stuff, and nice job, but really not worthy of any camera time. And I ended up, a friend of mine, she went to work for a measurement technology company in the Midlands, a small company that became real geeks in knowing how things were assembled. And I'm not going to go into sort of too much detail of that, A, because it's quite boring, and B, because they're still in business and they're friends of mine. So I got a job working in the office there. And again, no great technical qualifications, but I was always curious about how certain things went. So when everybody buggered off home, I'd sit in the workshop and I'd do some tests and measure things, and I got quite good at it. And the company was founded by a very eccentric English inventor, and you might know the sort. So he always had a tweed jacket. I think he washed about once a month, quite overbearing, quite loud, and just one of the nicest people ever. And he's no longer with us, which is probably the reason I can say these things about him. But honestly, he was an absolutely wonderful chap, and he was quite sweary. I don't know if you've got a beep function now. The managing director one day came into the office, small company, and he'd spotted me, and he was listening to me on the phone. And after I finished the conversation, he said, "You've got a way with words, so why don't you just fuck off and sell something?" Which I thought was great, and he gave me the break, really. So the next day I went out and was given an old plastic briefcase full of brochures, this is all pre-internet, and keys to a Peugeot 306 XLDT, I think it was, and I did F off and go and sell things. The traditional sales reps covered the Midlands and the north and the UK and the south and so on, and they said, you can have South Wales because nobody wants to go there. So I'd get up stupidly early, I would drive down from the Midlands to South Wales, and I would knock on the doors of companies making car components. Many of these factories were ex-British Leyland of some flavour or other that had been sold off, or Lucas or something else. And really many of them told me to go away, and full of youthful enthusiasm, I wouldn't really take no for an answer. So I'd knock on the door and I'd go back, and I would say to them, do you have issues with scrap? Are you scrapping many components? Are you getting many complaints from your customers because of how you're assembling and measuring your products? And of course, eventually some of them cracked or probably took pity on me, I think was probably closer to the mark. And I started to sell measurement technology to these companies, and I got very, very good at it. Around the same time, so again, this is in the early to mid 90s now, I started to see funny things. I started to see unusual things, not only in the data of the measurements that we took in terms of, well, that's unusual, because again, that's not really of interest for today's audience, I suppose, but just those workshop mishaps and nonsense. So, for example, I went to a company, again, I won't name them, but they made very large automotive components in South Wales. And the company, around the time the Welsh government was giving a lot of grants to businesses to encourage startups and stuff. So a very large German company bought this scabby old factory, employed all these disgruntled ex-miners and to make car parts. And it went quite well. They paid very well. There wasn't a lot of work there, and they were making nice product. That's not the reason for the story. But what really tickled me and got me on the track to writing a book was that the Germans couldn't find anybody to go and manage the site, because the Germans, the senior management in Germany, all had families and they had well-established routes. And honestly, none of them wanted to go and live at the end of the M4. So they tended to send young graduate engineers who'd been to business school in Frankfurt or whatever, and exceptionally clever guys, very talented guys, but with no life skills. So you can see where this is heading. You've got work to rule unionised ex-miners in a car factory, and very idealistic, bright, enthusiastic, exceptionally naive German management. And of course, it all came to a head, and they realised that they couldn't strike the workers. And I genuinely don't remember what the incident was that sparked this mutiny, but it was essentially a mutiny. So there I am as an Englishman, as a supplier, but a regular visitor there, and I'm kind of swept along with all of this, and it was very funny. So they all went to the pub, and I'm talking not one or two workers, I'm talking dozens, if not a couple of hundred workers, went to the pub and said, what can we do about it? I'm not going to attempt a Welsh accent because I think it would offend people. And they all switched from speaking English to Welsh overnight. So the management would turn up, and of course these German guys would speak beautiful English, but they didn't speak a word of Welsh. And suddenly they would issue orders and try to direct the work, and the workers wouldn't understand them, or would feign ignorance and only answer in Welsh. So the management panicked and they rang HQ in Germany and said, what do we do? So the management said, well, you better all learn how to speak Welsh then. So all of these young German engineers and managers were sent to night school. So they do very long days in the factory, longer than ever, because they didn't understand what was going on. And they're even having to produce like work instructions in Welsh and stuff, which just absolutely kills me. So these young managers went to night school. They went all the way into Cardiff. They did night school and they learned how to speak Welsh. And after 3 months, they could speak a bit of Welsh. After sort of 6, 8 months, they could actually go into the factory and run the factory in Welsh, and which I think is brilliant. And so then the workers reconvened and said, well, they've rumbled us here, what do we do? So they just switched back to English to make the whole thing utterly, utterly pointless. And I love the fact that on LinkedIn, there's probably half a dozen German engineers with, expertise in, Kaizen, lean manufacturing, and all of these prints and all these nice processes, and fluent written and spoken in Welsh. And I think that's great. I had the 306 for only about 6 months. It was a small company, and I was quite good at the job. So fairly quickly, I got promoted. And I ended up basically covering the Midlands and the south of the UK, which of course brought me head first into the morass that was Rover at the time. And of course, talking about car factories and things going wrong, Rover was really the place to be. We saw some just crazy stuff. I don't think this was Rover specifically, but they'd introduced a clocking in system, a computerized clocking in system, because people were fiddling their working hours. And people kept vandalising the machine because they didn't want to be tracked by a machine. So they put the automated clocking in system with these fancy plastic cards in a welded steel box with a tiny slit. So all you could see was the slit. And it was like, 10 mil thick welded steel bolted to the wall. It was bomb-proof. And one day they had a terrible accident where somebody had driven a forklift, and accidentally the prong of the forklift had gone through the slot and smashed the machine behind. I mean, it was like the equivalent, if you were playing darts, to make an analogy, it was like standing in a pub car park and throwing a dart through the window and hitting a bullseye. It was that done with such precision. And the irony was, there's no precision in the work of these guys at all. They hated working there and they wanted to go home. But I started to admire the chicanery and the devious bad practices. I became weirdly addicted to it. And as I got better in my job of measuring and testing things precisely and being really almost an expert, uncomfortable with that word, but very good at measuring things precisely, I actually got more of a kick from the slapdash bodgery. And again, that all sort of fed into the book. There was another instance where there was a chap who had a prosthetic leg. And it was law, HSE rule, that you had to wear steel toe cap boots, as with a lot of these places. And this chap's job was to weld something. So there were 2 or 3 people, and you'd kneel down and you'd weld, but he had a prosthetic leg. So you don't buy one false boot. So he got basically a steel toe cap boot for both feet. And you might know that when you have steel toe cap, sometimes the leather rubs through and the steel pokes out through the thing, and it's fairly normal. And I heard this amazing story, and I don't know if I want it to be true or not, but you can decide on the ethics of it. But he was kneeling down welding something, and somebody saw him, and they very carefully put a little spot weld on they noticed his toe cap was touching the metal grating on the floor, so they welded his boot to the floor without him noticing, as he was mask on welding something else. And of course, he went to stand up and basically pulled his own leg off, which is... I shouldn't laugh. I'm sure the chap was very angry, but probably knowing the workplace, he probably dished out a few similar instances himself, but just madness, absolute madness. And again, that chap made a component that lives on in cars today, and really that's how I got into cars. So I started to visit tier 1 automotive suppliers and car manufacturing companies themselves, the R&D departments, and also the assembly lines. And my particular area of expertise was in fasteners, how things are bolted together, screwed together, fitted together. So I became a bit of a nerd with friction and clamp force and torque and those sort of things. And because I'd gotten quite good at it, I remember the managing director, who was sort of so swearily had kicked me out the door a year or 2 before with a brochure, with a bag full of brochures saying, go and effing sell something. He called me into his office and I thought, I'm going to be in trouble now. And he said, we can't bloody keep up with the orders. And he was delighted. And he said, I'm going to swear again, he said, what the fuck are the competition doing? And the truth is, I didn't know. I was so wrapped up in my own world of charging around and making calls and seeing customers that I really hadn't thought about what the competition were doing. So I was starting to make a bit of money. I was on a commission, which was pretty good. The company had a piece of equipment that they couldn't sell. So Mr. MD, the mad inventor, had invented this test machine. I won't go into too many details. And on paper, it was fabulous. Nobody had ever done it before. It was an amazing thing. It could replicate a kind of assembly process and reduce scrap and improve tooling and all these wonderful things. But nobody bought it. And he said, if anybody can sell this, he said, if anybody can sell one of these damn machines, he said, I'll give you £2,000 in cash. And I thought, and that was a lot of money back then. It's quite a lot of money now. So I thought, well, okay, I'm going to make this my life's mission now. So I went to Dagenham, which was just terrifying. And basically I sold one of these things, and then I sold another. And I think I sold 3 or 4 in a month and made quite a lot of money for a small company. And to be fair, I got paid. They were great, they paid me, but they changed the rules instantly when I sort of turned up with orders for Ford want one, and I think GM wanted one. I think I sold one to BMW as well, and suddenly they were all very excited. Got married around that time, got married quite young, and had 3 kids in fairly quick succession, 3 daughters who are all amazing characters in their own right. Youngest is a proper petrol head. She would have quite loved to have come here today, I think. And led quite a happy, normal life. Bought a semi-detached house. I was given a choice of company cars, and I'd started to watch the touring cars, and I was watching the Volvo 850s and Nissan Primeras and all these things. And I test drove an Alfa 155, which should have got on the company scheme because, of course, it's covered by warranty, and if it doesn't work, you throw it away and you get another one. But I didn't. I went for a Honda Accord, which is just an incredibly reliable thing. So I did 60,000 miles a year for 2 years, knocking on doors and running around. I mean, that's a lot of mileage. There was no laws on driving on a mobile phone, so the company said, we'll give you a Motorola flip front phone with a big brick battery. So I drive down to the south of the UK, a couple of hours drive, just solidly on the phone with like yellow pages in my lap, just cold calling. So when I arrived at where I was going, I would have plenty of appointments lined up, and I became kind of a machine. I worked out that to keep the company afloat, we needed orders worth X per year, pick a number. And theoretically, I could do so many visits. So you think, okay, it's 52 weeks in a year. You have 4 or 6 weeks holiday. I'm going to be sick for a week. I don't know. So you worked out, and how many appointments a day can I do realistically? And that answer was 3. So you might visit a customer, you measure something for a couple of hours, do a presentation, you might sell it, you have a meeting. But basically, you've got 2 or 3 hours, 2 or 3 times a day. But then I sort of did some reverse math. So if I can hit my budget by doing 2 or 3 meetings a day, if I do 4 meetings a day, I'm going to increase my sales by a third. So I got addicted to making visits. So I'd get out of bed, stupid, and I'm not a morning person, you can tell my haggard face, and it's an early morning shoot here. I'd get out of bed stupidly early in the morning, knock on doors, make endless calls, and was doing like 6 meetings a day. And it was almost like speed dating. Hello, I'm here, that's wrong, do this, that's crap, here, it's fixed, 50 quid, thank you, I'm gone. Bang, and out the door. It wasn't quite 50 quid. And I started to travel. So the first place I went to was Germany. And our biggest competitor was a very large, very, very good German company. And here we are, slightly scruffy, shambolic English company with very wonky German, telling VW and Porsche how to assemble their cars. You know, when you're young, you don't have that. You don't have any self-doubts. You think you can do anything. And maybe it's arrogance, and probably it is, I don't know. But it's like, well, I can solve that. I just need to find the right person to talk to solve it. But I thought, I need to get a bit smart. So I bought a suit, I think it was from Burton's. I'm not sure where it was from, but it was just a cheap, thin suit. And I went to Porsche, and we had a meeting, and they were using a particular kind of tool, and it's making a bit of a mess. Now, it's really important to point out what era this was. So this was probably about 93, 94, something like that. Forgive me if I'm a year or 2 out with that. And in my opinion, that was the era where Porsche had the greatest quality. If you look at the vehicles they were making at the time, the 993, the 968, these kind of things, these are famously reliable cars. These are exceptionally well-built cars, even to this day. And they were really on the edge of that industrial era. They were still using thick steel, they were still using lead in the paint, they were still assembling things and having somebody check it afterwards. And there were these layers of control that you don't have in the business now. Get it right first time, automated, and so on. And Porsche is a different business today. I'm not, I don't own one. I wouldn't say I'm a fan either. But they have their problems, like everybody. And I think that era was really peak quality control for me. However, they were in huge trouble financially, huge trouble, because they couldn't afford to make cars that way anymore. People like Toyota were coming along and others making cheap and cheerful sports cars and, you know, MX-5s. I love MX-5s. And okay, you wouldn't have an MX-5 over a Porsche, but they showed the customers that you don't have to pay a lot of money to have some fun. So Porsche really ran into some trouble. So I got a bit of an audience with them to talk to them about things. Now, Porsche is in Zuffenhausen, it's in Stuttgart, and they speak Swabian German. So if you imagine, I've got a bit of a boring Midlands accent, if you imagine talking to a Yorkshireman or a Geordie or something, it's quite a distinct accent. So a lot of the people I was dealing with, they weren't necessarily very senior people, but there were guys who had been there from their apprenticeship, and there were guys in their 50s, and you've got some spotty-faced English chap who's 20-something trying to tell them what they're doing was wrong, and I never really got very far. I had a couple of just humiliating moments, again, which I don't think I've ever admitted before, but I had this thin suit on. I was sat talking to this chap in German, and I thought, does he understand me? You know, is my German good enough? Am I getting anywhere? And I'm trying to tell him what to do. And as I'm looking at him, he's kind of looking at me, and he kind of looks at my lap and looks up again. I think, okay, I don't know what's going on here. And I carried on talking, and he looked down again, and I noticed there's a long blonde hair in my lap. And it's a black suit, thin black suit. So I sort of thought, so I spotted it. It's clearly bothering him. So I just sort of brushed it like that and carried on talking. He looked down again, and it was still there. Oh, bloody hell. So I got hold of this hair, and I just did that. But it was a pubic hair that had poked through my very thin boxers and my very thin suit. And I pulled it out. Of course, I was like, oh, I didn't expect that. But I could not have humiliated myself greater with this guy. So the meeting sort of came to an end, and it was a bit like The Apprentice, where I sort of held up my hand to shake him, and he wouldn't shake my hand, and I wouldn't have shaken my own hand either. So that was the dealings with Porsche. I did sell them some kit in the end. Yeah, actually, I did. Yeah, later on a later visit, a different department, and it was never mentioned. It was here's the Englishman that likes to mutilate his genitals in meetings. So that was. But I had a huge fun, and I love that. I absolutely love, and still do love that part of Germany. And they it's not good to generalise, but that part of the world has kind of a make do amend attitude that appeals to the sort of working class nuts and bolts bloke that I am. So I particularly like that. Later, a couple of years later, when I was starting to earn pretty good money, I decided to buy. I'd always wanted a Porsche 959. And sat here with, you know, you probably see my breath, and it's cold, and we're in a shed and all the rest of it. You know, I'm never going to have the budget for that. But I bought a 968 Sport, which would have been made in the factory, and I know I worked on the measurements of that, and it proved to be, even after many years, of course, because I bought this some year, it wasn't a new car, it's superbly reliable. It was and not only reliable, that wasn't the main reason I bought it, but it's a fabulous car to drive. It's one of I would say, probably the easiest car to drive quickly I've ever had. You could ring it out to 90-95%, know exactly what it was doing, and you'd be very comfortable. No ABS, no traction control, no airbags, none of that nonsense. But still, you didn't have to be some kind of super stig to drive it. And I loved it because it was a little reflection of my past. I felt like I've worked on that, and that's pretty cool. And that was the first really, I had a Cavalier SRI, which was all understeer and horribleness. But coming from some quite modest cars and boring company cars, you don't appreciate these things. You get it, think it's so fast, I can't hold on. And now it was a Mark II Cavalier SRI with a two-tone paint. The bottom was anthracite, the top was like a Helios blue, pale metallic blue. And I loved it. And it was the 115 horsepower, not the 130 horsepower. So, you know, it's kind of weedy numbers. But at the time, it was insanely quick. And then you think, just a few short years later, I'm in this 968, which, you know, there's plenty of quicker cars out there. But it was just an amazing thing. I'm going to come back to working in the UK because it wasn't all international stuff. I went to a company, it was a Norwegian aluminium company that were working on a tub, and it was all a little bit hush-hush, and I had to sign sort of an NDA and stuff, but truth is I just signed the NDA myself, but I'll just write it scruffy so nobody knew who'd signed it, because, you know, the company owner wouldn't sign anything. And they wanted to do some tests on this aluminium tub, and I cut a long story short, that became the Lotus Elise. And it was amazing because the things they were doing with fasteners and bonding and materials was unlike anything I'd seen anywhere. And the wonderful thing with Lotus, as we'll all know, is they really take chances and they really push the boundaries. So I felt that I was listened to, and I felt that I had some clout and I was adding some value to what they were doing, and it was a good feeling. It was really nice. I wasn't dealing directly with Lotus at that time, but with a tub supplier. And I saw the very first Elise, and I saw actually one of the first production Elises got run over by an HGV, and it was that awful crunching, crumpling sound. It's still got that ringing around in my head now. But I just was absolutely blown away by how light and simple and the minimal everything. I remember discussions about how thin can we make the glass? Can we make the glass even thinner? Can we make the glass even thinner? And to save what? And it was really exciting engineering, and in many ways still a very analog way of doing it, very hands-on, manual calculations, manual testing, and it was exciting. And I vowed to buy one, and I did. And I would have brought it today, but it's snowing outside, and I'm a coward, so I didn't. So yeah, many years later, I got my Elise as well, and they were amazing. I went also to Ketteringham Hall. So Colin Chapman, when he was alive, had basically numerous businesses. He had a boat manufacturing company, an aircraft and unmanners, and he owned, or the company owned, Ketteringham Hall, which is a stately home near the Hethel factory. And in like some stables near there, sort of around the back, they were preparing cars for endurance racing. So I saw like the last of the Esprit GT3s being built for racing. And I think it was the last place I ever went where I saw people smoking at work. And I don't know if they should have done or not, whether I'm getting people into trouble now, decades on, but to see somebody having a smoke at work, not that I smoke, but it's like, yeah, these don't care. These people are here not for their appearance, not for the cleanliness of their lab coat. They're here because they know what they're doing, and they just stretched absolutely everything mechanically, and it was a fabulous place to go. I absolutely love the Elise. I've had it a few years now, and it has been my favourite car to own, not just because of my own tiny microscopic involvement in its development or production. But just because it feels like me. Now, when I picked it, I really wanted a Rover engined car. I really wanted like that original pure recipe. And I was well aware of all of the shortcomings. And I hate those lazy acronyms about, lots of trouble, usually serious, because it's just kind of pub talk, and it's invariably from people that are quite, well, normally I avoid such people in pubs. But yeah, my head gasket has gone, and I did get that done, and it really wasn't a big deal. I wanted a K-Series because I'd spent some time at Longbridge, and I'd seen how Rovers were made. Now, the K-Series engine was obviously a big company, Rover, with different plants, but the K-Series is made in a genuinely really interesting way, or interesting to me. This is where all your viewers will go and make a cup of tea now, because they might find this dull. It's to do with casting, it's to do with weight. So Lotus wanted a relatively powerful but very, very light engine. And the reason the K-Series is a very light engine is when it is cast, so to make an engine, you basically make a mould. So imagine making a mould out of sand, like you would with a jelly, and you pour in hot molten metal. And you would pour it in from the top. This is how all engines are pretty much made. And you end up with a block, and the block gets machined. But you're getting what's called inclusions. So tiny, tiny airborne microscopic imperfections get into the metal. So if you imagine if you're making a jelly, and you boil up the gelatin, the little cubes you get, and you put the hot water in, but you're getting scale out of the kettle, or if there's dirt in the bowl, and that then goes into the jelly, and it's not very good. And those things are tiny weaknesses. So if you imagine with an engine, it heats up, it cools down, it heats up, it cools down, it's being constantly shaken. They over-engineer these things. So when they make a block, they tend to make the walls a little bit thicker, so there's no risk of damage, because they know there's going to be inclusions. How the K-Series is made, or was made, is they would pump the molten metal in from the bottom. So they'd have a mould, but instead of pouring it from the top where crap could get in, they'd pump it in from the bottom where nothing could get in. So all of any inclusions or anything that shouldn't have been there would float to the top. So which meant that it was a purer piece of metal, so they could use less metal. They could make the walls thinner because they weren't making allowances for rubbish getting in there. And I kind of like that. And I saw a picture of them making it. I went to site and I looked at it. I thought, that's really cool. I really like how they've done it. So that's why I ended up with a K-Series engine. But I did end up with head gasket failure as well, which was a couple of £100 to fix. Not a big deal. And that's the only thing that's gone wrong with my Elise. I have a theory also that interesting cars and interesting people tend to go together. And when I bought my Elise, I bought it privately. It came from Bell and Colville originally. I bought it second hand, and it was sold privately. And it was a very kind of amateurish written advert with one terrible photograph, but it was the exact spec I wanted. It's a Sport 135, so it's got ported head, revised ECU, fancy exhaust, so 135 horsepower, which sounds nothing, but it's enough. It's the exact colour I wanted, spec, mega low mileage, and it was for sale in the Cotswolds. So I went to look at it thinking this is either going to be some rogue with a dodgy advert or it's going to be perfect. And so it proved to be. So the chap selling it was a retired RAF wing commander who was like 6'5", something, 6'6". He had osteoporosis and he couldn't get in. And he took the car to church, and it was just one of these absolute cherished, wonderful cars. And I've ended up in a kind of a pen pal scenario with him because he's not of the email age. I think I'm barely of the email age. So we write to each other. So if I do something with the car, I send him a photograph and a little postcard and say, had a wonderful trip out, went to wherever, did this, here's a picture of the car. And if the car ever appears in print, because obviously I write for a few magazines as well now, I'll just send him a copy. And it's really nice to have this very old-fashioned pen pal relationship with a chap called Russell who lives in the Cotswolds. So yeah, that's my story with Lotus and with Rover. One of the first car manufacturers as opposed to component manufacturers I went to in England after I'd finished sort of working just in Wales was IBC, which was or is part of GM. Basically, it's the factory in Luton that makes the Frontera. So I went to look at the Frontera and the neighbouring plant, which at the time was making the Vectra, had started to make the Vectra. And I saw a tiny piece of vandalism which totally appealed to me. So you have a production line, and at the end of the production line, you have a rectification area. So cars that come off the line. So if the workers can stop the production line, they can pull a thing, press a button, it stops the line dead if there's a problem. But it's costing them tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pounds a minute to stop the line because it means they're not making cars. So they would seldom do it, but they would leave notes on the car and it would get to the end of the line and anything that wasn't right would be put to one side. And if anyone has ever been to that factory, or went to that factory, you might remember there was a sign that said warning vehicles emerging from left because it's a busy site. And somebody had added a C, so it said warning vehicles emerging from cleft, which seemed like strangely appropriate because one of the first times I went, I looked and said, are these all finished cars? A huge yard full of these cars finished, are these going to customers? No, that's rectification. And it seemed to me that they were building more cars that had to be rectified than actually went off to be delivered to customers. And nowadays, of course, you might have one or two cars a week, perhaps per shift, that need some minor rectification. But here they were churning out endless things. And they had like a barcoded system where they could report, so if their station was to, I don't know, fit the airbags or fit the steering wheel in the airbag, for example, if it wasn't right, it wasn't safe, they could tag it, it would print a stick and they'd put it on the windscreen and then somebody would come along and say, beep, oh yeah, need to fix this. But for some reason, they didn't, I don't know why, whether it's workmanship or process and management or what, and probably unfair to point it out after so many years, but they'd leave notes saying things like brakes fucked, steering fucked, and it just, I found that hugely amusing. I thought that was fabulous. The Frontera factory was really something, and I was quite nervous going there. And the very, very first time I went there, I had a suit on. I don't know why I was wearing a suit. I drove down the M1. I got there stupidly early, and I used to drink a lot of coffee because I kind of buzz along. And I got there and I really needed a wee. There's a park nearby, some public loos. I'll just dash in and have a wee. And I was absolutely bursting by this point. So I sort of dashed into these public loos and I'd started to have a wee and I noticed that there were people cottaging in these toilets. So in my panic, and I was at mid-flow, I weed down my own leg. It was awful. And I thought, do I go and buy some, and sort of scarpered, because I'm a bit of a coward with such things. And I didn't know whether to go and buy another suit, which I couldn't really afford to do, or what. So I sort of turned up at this meeting, and the bloke was like, and I thought, I can't tell him it. I'm weed on myself because I'm scared of, homosexuals in public toilets. But, dreadful. But that place never got any better. If there was a break, I was dealing with a chap who was I won't say the production manager, but he was in charge of quality. He was the man. And there was a line stop, and I went to look for him because we were trying to test something. I walked down the production line, and you imagine the end of a production line is a finished car with the stickers on its head, things like brakes, fucked, shagged, and other such base terminology to describe life-threatening problems with a car. And you walk down the line, of course, they become less and less finished until you arrive at body and white. And I got to sort of quite near the start of the production line, and there was the man responsible for quality, and he sat feet up in a Frontera, smoking a cigarette, eating a sandwich with his feet sort of up where the dash would be, like with a what kind of expression on his face. And I thought, if this chap is responsible for building these things, if he's supposed to be the guy that they look up to build a decent quality car, and there he is sat smoking in a car, eating a sandwich, like what hope is there for this place? And so it proved to be. I think if you look at things like the JD Power, I think a year or two afterwards rated it like the worst car according to customer satisfaction, worst for quality and so on. Now that's not that I've got a downer on Fronteras or anything else, because all the factories I went to had problems. Some just had more problems than others. And certain brands that might have a reputation for not great reliability, I absolutely love. I bought a Fiat built in '72, Fiat 500, because I always wanted one. And then if I go, I bought this quite recently just for a bit of fun. But if I go back to when I dealt with Fiat, when I was dealing with sub-suppliers to Fiat, I remember going to a component supplier who made wiring looms in Italy, and we were doing some testing, and there was a whole batch that was just wrong. And it's simple things like the wires weren't pushed into the connector. So this loom is going to reach a production line. Some lady is going to plug in the connector, plug in a wiring loom, and it looks okay, and it'll go out to the customer, but you could see that it was broken, that it wasn't going to work. And I said to this chap, well, this batch you can't send that out, that's faulty. He went, it's for Fiat. And he actually said that, like, it's for Fiat, like, I'm the idiot for pointing out the fault with the quality. And that stuck with me. But I weirdly love Fiat. There's two Pandas and a Fiat 500 at home, and I absolutely love Fiat. So it's not like I've got it in for any one brand over the other, because they all made mistakes, and we all make mistakes. We're only human. And that was, I think, the appeal of the job, was meeting very interesting people, very unlike me. I remember going to, I was at Mercedes-Benz, and in that part of Germany, maybe they still do, they have a thing called Ruhetag, which British people might know as half-day closing. You know, you'd have a afternoon, Wednesday, Thursday afternoon, where they would just shut everything and have some family time and slow down. It's a really nice idea, I have to say. I'd like to reintroduce that. And I was stopping in a pub, and I was sat having a ham sandwich, drinking a beer, and I always try to read the local newspapers just to get a feel for what's going on and sort of improve my German language. And this old boy spotted me, and I think he was a bit lonely. And he asked me something, and we sort of got chatting, and he heard my accent, and he said, are you Danish? I said, no. He said, are you Dutch? No, I'm English. This chap just went off on one. He was shouting, he was angry, he was banging the table, and we're in a beer garden in the Alps, and it was beautiful, and I didn't get what his problem was. I slowly came to understand what he was ranting on about, because he had one ear, and apparently the British had shot his ear off in the war. And of course, that was all entirely my fault. So I said to this chap in German, I said, look, I wasn't there. I was born many years afterwards. I said, maybe my granddad shot your ear off. Maybe you deserved it. I said, but can we just have a beer? And this fellow laughed, which was fortunate. And he was a really nice old stick. And I can compare him to my granddad, who passed away a few years ago. When he learned that I was speaking German, he said, well, what the bloody hell do you want to speak German for? The only good German's a dead German. Which is awful language. I don't like that. But he really was just, my granddad and this old German bloke were the same people, and they got the same backgrounds. And I was quite sure, and it's such a shame we could never, if I could put them in a pub together and buy them a beer, they would either kill each other or be the absolute best of friends. But that was the appeal of the job, was not so much the machinery that was being made, but the people that you get to meet, and the little private stories that you tell, and the adventures. So after doing a pretty good job in the UK and earning some money, started to work abroad more often, Germany and Sweden and the Czech Republic and so on. We set up a joint venture in Sweden, because we're doing a lot of work with Saab, as was, rest in peace, Saab. And Volvo. And I loved Volvo, and I had started to watch the touring cars, I think I might have mentioned earlier, and I loved the 850 in particular. The 850 wagon was such a great thing. And Volvo had just a meticulous attitude to building cars or developing cars. And a lot of their production is actually done in Belgium, or it was at the time. But I love going there so much, and it got me into good food because, you know, I hope my mum doesn't watch this because she'll kill me, but my mum's cooking, she'd do a thing called mince and boilies, and it was minced beef and onions and gravy and boiled potatoes. And she loves it, my dad loves it, my sister loves it, but I really hate that kind of food. That, you know, that English stodge is not my thing. So when I started to go to Volvo, the canteen there was, and still is, spectacularly good. So I've never had salmon like it before, and cured fish and sill, like pickled herring, and the black bread, and it was amazing. And at that time, the canteen was free for visitors. So I would go to Gothenburg, I'd go to Sweden, different places in Sweden and visit, and we were paid like a daily allowance for meals on the company, which was quite modest, I forget the number. And it's quite expensive to eat in Scandinavia, as you know. So I used to pretend I was visiting somebody at Volvo. I'd go to reception, I'm here to see Mr. Olsen or Mr. Larson, just make up a name. And say, oh yeah, great, and they give you your pass and then you go. And I'd go and eat in the canteen, berserker visitor, sticker on, and I would go and eat this amazing food. I remember sitting there for about 2 hours once, just binging on, like, and it's not even like I'm eating junk food or ice cream, it was just like the best salads and the best breads, and like even things like the eggs were just like, what is the difference between a Swedish chicken and a British one? But like, it just tastes so good. So I had a wonderful time there. Later in life, because of an affection I had for Volvo, I'd done a little bit of work on the 5-cylinder engine, which actually has its roots with Audi. So that T5 engine really had its roots with Audi. And we'd done some work on cylinder head bolts and so on, which I quite liked, and I liked the people. And then fast forward years later, when my kids came along, my first family car was a Volvo 850R, which was a fabulous thing. So I got it from Speeds in West Bridgeford, who were really nice to me. They bought my wife at the time a bunch of flowers, which I'd never had with a car before, and it was like, I actually said to the fellow, I'm not paying for the tight northern, you know, I'm not paying for those. He went, no, it's complimentary. So, oh, thanks. And my wife at the time said, I gave her the keys, and I said, this is great, family car, get the kids in the back, and you know, they're wonderful things. My car had a little sticker on the back, and I didn't know what it meant, and I asked the garage, and they said, we don't know either. And I found out that it was one of, I believe, 6 cars that TWR Racing had prepped for press use or for media use. And I think I ended up with one of those cars because I never had it rolling roaded, but it had way more than the 286, whatever it was, BHP. It had a very primitive traction control that I think was driven off of the ABS sensor. And my wife took it out and she said, I don't like this new car. I said, what's wrong with it? It's beautiful, like olive green colour, leather interior. I mean, just fabulous, solid thing. Like the wood dash with really thick. You ever pick one of those panels off? Everything's so substantial. She said, it goes zzz. I said, what do you mean it goes zzz? She said, well, whenever I drive it, it just goes zzz. I said, what do you mean? So we loaded up the kids, took it out, gave her the keys, and she drove down the street. She put her foot down. It's the front tyres because the traction control was rubbish. It's just zzz. So I had it for a few years and it was just magnificent, but I sold it because basically it just ate through. It had like Pirelli P Rossa, P0s, whatever we were at the time. They were mentally expensive tyres and it just chewed them off every journey. I remember I wasn't worried about fuel consumption, I wasn't worried about service, none of that mattered. It was a great car. I simply couldn't afford to put rubber on it every 10 minutes. So that was my story with Volvo. So this period of my life, we're talking about sort of 4, 5, 7 years of working in this quality control and test and R&D environment with fastenings and so on. I'd started in the UK, basically the office boy, and then I started to travel abroad. And at that time, VW were really getting their teeth into Skoda. But back then, there was quite a distinction between the cars that were made by Skoda and by VW. And I went to Mladá Boleslav in the Czech Republic to help with it. And we had an agent there, and everything was done via an agent. And agents are great, because my Czech was almost non-existent. So I think the Czech word for yes is no. So if you say no, it means yes. I remember pivo is beer and prosit is cheers, and that's about all the Czech I remember. So we used to go to car factories in Eastern Europe and Skoda was one of them. And at that time, they just started getting into making the Octavia. And at pretty much the same location, they were still making the Favourite. So if you remember the chunky little Skoda Favourite. And we were doing some tests to compare things because the Germans were putting a colossal amount of investment in, and they were trying to automate it and basically remove the workers from the production line. Now, I like people, and I understand that progress is important, but it's not nice to think about people losing their jobs. And I was part of this process to help test what is the difference between the two production techniques. So you've got the Octavia, which is basically a golf in a frock, I believe, following very similar methods to what they did in Wolfsburg. And then you've got a production line making a Favourite where everything's being done by hand. And we found that the guys making the vehicles by hand, when you tested them and you actually measured their output, it was just as repeatable and just as accurate as that being done by the machines. Now, the machines were slightly better, but it was so tiny, it was barely noticeable. And you know, if you, for example, if you tighten a nut and a bolt, you can feel, you take the bottle off the cap off a pop bottle or Coke bottle, you know how many Newton meters, you can kind of feel it. But these guys had done the job for so long that they had a feeling for it. So they were so consistent in what they did. And I think at the time, there's all those awful jokes about, you know, Skoda. Why does a Skoda have a heated rear windscreen to keep your hands warm? And what do you call a Skoda convertible? It's a skip, and all these playground jokes. But the truth was, Skoda made bloody good cars, and they were very good engineers. And the Czechs, generally speaking, have a very long history in engineering. Some fabulous engineers. So the Volkswagen didn't just buy a huge factory and some cheap labour. They actually bought a lot of know-how. And I used to love going there. I had quite a few scrapes as well whilst I was working there. If you go back to sort of the communist era, and obviously this was many years after that, it was still long ago enough that you could still sort of see the fingerprints and the history of communism there. And it was quite a holiday thing to go to like a health spa. So you would go to... It was very sort of Germanic in a way as well, sort of, you know, 50 push-ups and drink some water and hot spas and baths, and they're big into saunas and hot spas and all of that malarkey. And the owner of, I don't know quite how I ended up there, but almost certainly a backhander was involved, what they described as a luxury spa hotel. And I thought, well, this is great. It was £7 a night. I remember it was £7 a night, or the equivalent of in krona. And when I got there, they refused to let me carry my own bags. All of the staff looked like nurses, and I now know it's because they were nurses. They had like white coats and nets on their hair. And when I checked into a room, the room was tiled, the floor was tiled, the walls were tiled, the ceiling was tiled. Like, it's quite difficult. Why would you? I don't know. Single bed, and they locked you in for the night. So I was locked in, and I thought, this isn't good at all. So in the morning, they'd unlock the door whilst I was sleeping, which I find a bit weird. So I got off, I'll have a quick walk around the grounds of this place. And the grounds, the fellow, I don't even want to say guests, I think that the fellow patients were suffering or working with significant mental health problems. These were people that would have been years ago in a sanatorium or an asylum of some sort, or perhaps were guests that had been there so long that they had lived there when it was a sanatorium, and now it's a luxury hotel, so £7 a night. And these were quite scary people to me. These people that needed a lot of help, waving their arms and screaming and throwing food and all sorts. And I couldn't wait to get out of there. And when I got picked up by our agent, the hotel security ran after me and said, you didn't eat breakfast. And it was hard-boiled eggs and this bread roll. And I said, I don't want it, thanks. And they said, you must eat it. And I said, I'm not going to eat it. And I had to lock the door, and they were banging on the window. Eat, you must eat. And I was thinking, just please go away. So it was really, really exciting and very scary. And just to sort of spin that on a little bit, I had one instance where I went to Moscow, and I stayed in a place, and they asked me for the key. So the word is kluj. And I have this thing where you stop abroad and you're in sort of spicy parts of the world, and this might be nonsense because I was really traveling a lot with the job now. If you give your key back to reception when you go out for the day, you're still stopping there. But they know that you're out, and they can get in your room and your stuff's in there. And I kind of don't like that, or you think your passport might be in there or something. I don't know what. So I don't do it. I always carry the key with me and say, don't make up the room. I'll sleep in my own filth. It's fine. Maybe I'm being overly cautious, but in Russia, in Moscow, you've got to watch it, right? You stand out. So I stopped in a place called the Hotel Sputnik, and I'm saying this because obviously at time of filming we're at, we're not exactly best friends with Russia. So I'm happy to libel and slander the Hotel Sputnik, and I picked it for the name. And I refused to give them the key. And this guy said, "Kluj," and I said, "Niet." And he said, "Da, Kluj," and I went, "Niet." And then, it all got a bit shouty, and I don't know what they're shouting, and I'm just shouting back, "Well, you can bugger off, you're not having it, you thieving get." I'm just giving it back. And they pulled a gun, and it's absolutely terrifying. So I gave him the key. But that hotel, the Hotel Sputnik, it's funny now, I'm laughing at it now, but at the time it was terrifying. So it was about 4th or 5th or 6th floor, and the room stank of cigarettes and sweat and God knows what else. And it was expensive, and it had a balcony. I thought, this would be great, and get a view of the city, and it would be wonderful. And the balcony door was held shut with a nail, like a bent over nail. So I sort of bent the nail. I thought, oh, this is charming, this is fun, and stepped out onto the balcony. And I'm very, very high up. But there was no handrail on the balcony. So it's just like, 6 foot of balcony and then off into the car park. Absolutely horrendous. And in the night, somebody tried to get in the room. But they weren't trying to get in through the room in the corridor. They were trying to get in through the window on the balcony. But bearing in mind, it's like 4 or 5 stories up. I've no idea how they got up there. But there's a silhouette of somebody, and they're giving it, bull, 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 bull. They're trying to get in. I thought, no way. So I pushed the fridge against the door, and they sort of shouted F off a couple of times and, sort of cried for my mum a bit. And then I heard a bit of a shout, and I didn't hear anything else. And I thought, okay, thank goodness, they've gone away. They've gone to rob somebody else. I checked out in the morning. Kludge! Okay, yeah, thanks, money, don't hurt me. Paid them cash, lots of paperwork. Very, very, very strange. And in the car park, almost directly beneath my window was, I don't know what the car was, but there was a car with the roof stoved in and all police taped off and an ambulance. And it might have been a coincidence, but I think what had happened was me shouting at the guy. I think he was trying to rob me in the night. I think he fell off the balcony and he would be dead because it was 4 or 5 floors up. But then you kind of have to keep your mouth shut because you're the Westerner there. I'm quite a naive, I wasn't that widely travelled at the time. I thought, there's no way I'm getting involved with the Rozzers here because this is not going to end well. With certain countries, of course, they're very, very unionised and very sort of state-controlled, and the mindset of some of the people we're working with was quite interesting. This kind of nonsense wasn't reserved just for Russia and Eastern Europe at the time. It happened all over. So some plants were very, very heavily unionised, which I kind of didn't agree with, but I also found it quite amusing, the things that they would kick off of. And, obviously prior to my time, looking back at the things, BL going on strike because they changed the time of the tea break, and just tiny things, changed the colour of the coats that they have to wear at work, even though they were free issued, they would go on strike. So there was still an element of that mentality in a lot of places. And one place I went to, which is, it's kind of a bittersweet story. It was a very large tractor factory in the south of the UK. The people there that I dealt with had worked there for years and years, and they were so set in their ways, and they're so slow at what they did, and they were basically always on strike over something, over nothing. I remember once I drove about 4 hours to go there to do like some emergency tests, and they said, oh, we're on strike. And I said, this is like an 8-hour round trip for me. I'm just here to help you. Can I just do this and you can pretend to strike afterwards? And they were having none of it. So they were really quite hard work. There were 3 guys that I used to deal with, and they went to school together. And I'm going to call them Tom, Dick and Harry. That's not their name. And they worked in like a test department. And it was their job to ensure that these tractors left the factory and were safe. And, we're sitting amongst all this lovely old machinery. You have an accident on a farm, it's going to hurt. If a wheel comes off, it's tough. These have got to be right. And they export these tractors all over the world. And you hope that the people care for what they do. But they were so worked to rule, it was insane. So I went to visit once, and I said, where's Dick, for example, one of the 3? And they said, oh, he passed away. I said, oh, bloody hell, I'm really sorry to hear that. You know, it's that's terrible news. And I said, do you mind me asking what happened? And they said, well, because he was a young fella. You know, these guys were in their probably 40s or 50s or something. So he had a heart attack. And then the story unravelled that these people were so worked to rule that in the morning he'd complained that he didn't feel too well. And they shared an office, and this office had one door in and one door out. And they said, he died on that spot in the doorway where you're stood. You think, oh, this is really awful, really macabre. So I'm sorry, you know, wife and kids and all the rest of it. And they said, oh yeah, but we weren't there when he went because it was our tea break. Well, what do you mean? He said, well, it was 11:30 and we have a tea break at 11:30. So he started to have his heart attack and we said, oh, we'll come back after we've finished our break. So they'd stepped over the body of a very ill man to go and have their tea break. And when they come back, I think the medics had arrived or something, but they'd abandoned him and he died. And it was so strange to see that they valued their working practices and their work to rule over the friendship of the people that they were with. And in many respects, I think that was why I was quite uncomfortable with any of that unionised work to rule stuff, because just as a rule can be set up to that you should obey, should look after you, it gives you an excuse to not do something else because it isn't written down and you lose that human touch. His wife obviously it was explained to his wife that he'd passed away, and you know, you'd think that you might explain that, you know, he went very quickly or he went in his sleep or something that would remove any pain from the family. But as Dick had passed away, Tom and Harry had said to us, oh no, that wasn't the case at all. No, he was writhing in agony when he went. And you just think, how can you be so bloody insensitive? Just awful place to go. Ford were a very interesting company to deal with. So in the 90s, Ford had what's known as the Premier Automotive Group, which was Aston, Volvo, Jaguar, I think it was. And of course, ugly old outposts like Dagenham, which had been churning out vehicles for years. So this is around the time they were making the Mark IV Fiesta, I think it was, and also the Mazda 121, which was basically the same thing with a little bit of different plastic trim on it. I get a weird kick now. I work with, you know, lots of interesting cars, and we're car people, and you know, you might see Exotica, and on your channel there's been some, you know, very exciting things. I get just as big a kick from spotting a Mazda 121 that's really just a repackaged thing. I know I'm strange. This is the point at which everybody clicks off and says I'm a total mustachioed freak. Anywho, I like Mazda 121s. I used to go to the factory. We supplied a very, very, very expensive piece of equipment to ensure that those cars were assembled to the way that the designer had intended. And Dagenham, it's all gone now, of course. It's all you know, demolished and housing and whatnot. At the time, it was just a colossal sprawling factory. I used to deal with a guy, a senior guy there, who had commissioned this piece of equipment, but was a raging alcoholic and a very angry and dangerous man, which at the time was funny, but now you wouldn't want to even share a lift journey with him, let alone do a couple of miles in a Fiesta with him ranting about the quality of the thing. And in turn, his sidekick was a chap who was either Canadian or American. And they were a very odd couple. You've got a very highly strung chap who'd worked there for years, the manager, who insisted that everything worked properly. And then you've got his sidekick, who was very unionised, very laid back. And they were physically very different. You've got one guy in a suit, the manager. The other guy, who was responsible for taking the measurements on the line and correcting faults, which sounds like a small thing, but is a big deal. It's making sure these things are safe. Wore like a blue boiler suit, and it was always unbuttoned to the navel, and he was always bare-chested, and I'm pretty sure he was al fresco underneath. I don't think this guy was wrapped up as warm as I am today in this cold shed. And he had, I thought it was a wig, but actually it was a comb-over hair. So he got like the Bobby Charlton, like comb-over hair like that, and a medallion, and like a hairy chest, and a very peculiar chap, and then like a very odd accent I couldn't really pin down, but North America somewhere. And he was very slow, and he was very droll. And we'd run a training session, and this piece of equipment was very difficult to use, frankly speaking. It's a complex piece of equipment at Ford in the 90s, and I said, it's imperative that you understand what we're doing here, Otherwise, you won't get the measurements that you want, and your cars will be wonky, and people will get hurt, and there'll be warranty claims, and it'll all turn to pants. So let's take a time to do this. So we had a training session which should last a day, and the manager said, you've got 10 minutes. And I said, I'm ever so sorry, but I can't cover this in 10 minutes. You've spent a huge sum of money on this. You can't ring me if it goes wrong. It won't tell you if it's wrong. You need to. You've got 10 minutes. You've got 10 minutes. So, we're going to need more than this. So I get into the training session. All the time, the American chap who stood there, and he's really not saying a lot. He's not taking any notes. And it became apparent that one was antagonising the other. They've worked together for years. And then we sort of got in, and this chap's hurrying me along, like, press this and do that. Just it's okay, just let me explain. And normally you'd run a training session and you try to teach people about how things are assembled, and you'd ask them some questions just to be sure that they've listened and just to be sure that they've understood, and just go over it to be sure that they're happy, really, because it's their investment. You know, it's their car factory, not mine. And this guy was so just, and he was so wound up. And then the American guy said, "Let's just stop." And there was a long pause, and he said, "It's my tea break now." So I thought, well, this is very odd. And the other fellow's like, we got fucking work, just. So I'm sort of watching these two, thinking, what on earth is going on with my life that I'm trapped in a room with these two maniacs, frankly. So the American chap then, he picks up a company phone and he rings directory inquiries, and he says, "I'd like the number for Boots Healthcare in Dagenham." And he has to get put through to like the beauty counter, and he's ordering hair dye. So the manager, who's watching, literally looking out the window, watching these wonky cars go off the production line with this hugely, and he's like, we've got to stop the production. And this guy's like, "Do you have auburn? Do you have like chestnut colour? I'm looking for something slightly richer than chestnut, but not as deep as, like a kind of ochre colour." And it absolutely killed me, because this guy wasn't faking it. This was the guy responsible for checking the cars on the production line. And there he was, ordering hair dye. And I'm kind of like trying not to look at him, but also I'm weirdly fascinated by him. Like, his hair was an odd colour and an odd shape, and I'm still not entirely sure it's not a wig. And there's not much more to that story than that, but it taught me that you bring people together and you give them this great corporate ideal, and you go to the showroom and you see a Fiesta and it's great and you buy it and you drive it. But some of the people putting these things together really shouldn't be allowed out into the real world, let alone into situations where they're managing the quality of it. Again, disclaimer, I have owned Fords, I like Fords, my daughter drives a Fiesta, everything's groovy, but my God, there are some freaks out there. These things are important. I know it's easy to get very sort of serious and suck the colour out of a bunch of silly anecdotes from my long and strange past, but these things do matter. Fasteners fail, components fail. This might be ABS. One of the companies I've talked about, I know, sent out cars with no airbags in. For example, you wouldn't tell by looking at it, but these cars are probably still out there. So such things are crucial. It's life and death, and road safety, particularly in the leery stuff that we all love to drive, it matters. And I like to think that all of the companies we've talked about here and all of the companies I've dealt with really genuinely do care about safety and the quality of the products, because they want to make the world a better place, which all sounds a bit hippy-dippy, I suppose. In reality, many of them were more concerned because they didn't want warranty costs and they didn't want complaining customers and loss of sales through bad PR. So maybe there's an overlap between those two elements, but it is important stuff. At the nerdy level, and I haven't talked about that too much, and James had said some of the viewers might be interested more in the nuts and bolts of it. I'm not going to do that here, because really you'll be losing subscribers by the dozen. I think there's only a certain amount of weirdos out there that are interested in friction and such things, strain and stress analysis. So that's quite bespoke. Maybe that's one for another time. But I think it's an important subject. But it's not that I was excited by the subject. The appeal for the job for me was in problem solving and meeting interesting people, and there were some great people. I'd like to talk also about the difference in business cultures between, let's make a comparison between Japanese cars and German cars, and we'll talk about quality. And quality is a very broad phrase. So it's quite often people will say, oh, German cars have got a great quality. And in my opinion, they're not referring to the mechanical quality of a product, but they're talking about the tactile things. So panel gaps, they're talking about the leather that they feel and that nice click that the button makes when you use it. Those sort of tangible things that you see. But in my opinion, that doesn't make a quality vehicle. You can take something like the Corolla, you know, the world's most produced car. There's nothing wrong with them, but also there's nothing very exciting either. But there's a quality in the repeatability of the quality of the product that they make. So the panel gaps might not be the snazziest, the plastic might be slightly shinier than you would want, but the mechanical integrity of it as a car is exceptionally high, and that's because it's made, you know, following a certain process. If you look at Japanese workers, if you look at white goods, for example, if you look at stereos, TVs, historically, when they were made in Japan, which was sort of huge in that electronic industry, you would have people assembling things manually, but in Japanese culture, as my understanding anyway, the people were quite happy to do the same task over and over, repetitive tasks, 3 or 4 jobs on a production line. And that was their job for life. They do that job for 5, 10, 50 years, whatever. They do the same job. And when you've got the same person doing it, it becomes extremely consistent. But the people are happy to do it. If you try and translate that into particularly a British mentality, people get bored pretty quick. And then they basically cause sabotage, or they muck around, and I'm smiling because I think that's all brilliant, because I am English and I do like a bit of nonsense. So I mentioned before I had Honda, and I'd worked at the Accord factory in Swindon, and just up the road at Cowley they were making the Rover 600, which is essentially the same car. Yet if you look at the stats of reliability between the two, there was quite some difference between the two, and I love both of them. I had the Accord company car. The 600, a Rover 620 Ti, would really get me going now. I'd absolutely love, my God, all my confessions are coming out today, but I'd love one of those. But in terms of reliability, they were worlds apart. And yes, the engines were different, but fundamentally it's the same product, built in the same area, but it's how they treated the people was the difference. And the Japanese had far more control over it. I used to go to Nissan a lot, and Nissan was a huge fanfare when they started to make the Bluebird in the UK back in the 80s. And by the time I got to them in the 90s, they were making the Micra and the Primera. And there was a certain kudos attached to it. Those cars were worth more in Japan. They built them with a little Union Jack on for certain models. And weirdly, in Japan, they've got such a fondness for British stuff, apparently, that they would pay a premium for those built in the UK, which I found quite kind of ironic. And there is a process which probably viewers will know called just-in-time. So instead of having huge warehouses full of components, the components will be delivered on a little robot, line side, just in time for production, so you don't have lots of stock sitting around. The robot, the delivery robot, which played a really annoying beepy jingly tune, would come and every sort of 1 hour would effectively just passively torture the line workers with its inane jingle. And I heard this thing, and I'm not going to do it now, but it's stuck in my head decades later. I woke up hearing it once, which is really, really worrying. Somebody took the magnetic tape, which was laid on the floor in order for the robot to follow, and was so sick of the robot that they basically moved it, and they laid new tape, and they laid it out the end of the production hall, out the end of the rectification hall, through the car park, and led it to the top of I think it's the A19 at the top, in an attempt to lure this beeping robot off down into the wilderness, just to bugger off and leave them alone so they could have some peace without it. And I love that, and I remember those moments more than the data, more than seeing things like the Primera GT and seeing the exciting things they did in touring cars. To me, that one little glorious moment where one man says, stuff it, I've had enough, I'm going to nobble that robot, is not something... This is another reason, of course, I use a pen name, is that in my professional life, really I shouldn't condone such things, but in my personal life and the life of writing books about car factories and mucking around with cars, I love to share these stories because I think it's fabulous. I think it needs documenting, and honestly, I think it needs celebrating. More robots need nobbling. To use the phrase cultural journey makes me sound like such a prat, but I'm going to say cultural journey because I got to meet different nationalities. That was always very interesting, but also different cultures, and different companies had different ways of doing things. One very big German manufacturer, for example, openly asked me for a bribe. Openly. There's a phrase, it's a Schmiergeld, meaning like lubrication money, and I was quite uncomfortable with it. It was a very large company, and it was very open, and we had to pay a very substantial bribe to a company in order to win a contract to do the test and measurement at this business. And I went back to my very eccentric English boss and said, I don't have any skills, I've just basically blagged this job my entire life, what do I do? And he said, go and tell him to fuck himself. So I went back to Germany, I met, let's call him Mr. Schmidt, and I went to see him, and he said, there's a phrase in German that translates to having a big hand under, großen Hand unter dem Tisch, like a big hand under the table. And I knew what was coming in this conversation, so I'm very sorry, but my boss says you've got to fuck yourself. And that was it. And I vowed never to buy one of their products in my life because we lost a contract because of bribe. I said, I'm never having one of your poxy cars. I think I had 5 on the bounce. I'm not going to name them, but I've had 5 of these German cars and they've all been very good. But the difference in culture is particularly interesting, and I think that leads into BMW and their acquisition of Rover. And Rover is a tumultuous business, and it's very easy to knock them. So many things they did that were wrong have overshadowed what they did that was very good. If you go back to the 50s, I think 50% of the world's exported cars were made in the UK, which is a tremendous figure. Cowley was always historically an exceptionally unionised, very set in its ways kind of factory. And I started when they were making the Rover 800, and they then made the Rover 600. And one of the joys I had was the roof leaked in one of the halls where they made the 800, and there was a puddle on the floor, and eventually a buddleia grew, beautiful purple weed of a plant. But I like buddleias because they attract butterflies, and I'm a bit of a softie for such things. And it was odd, you'd see a production line moving and making these cars, and then there was just this beautiful purple plant growing. But I also like that nobody ripped it up or cleaned it up either. It lived in its own little dirty puddle and it thrived, and I kind of like that nature over man thing going on. The quality stats for the 800 were so bad that they were fudged by 30%. So if a reading should be 100, and the tolerance should be X, they made it X plus or minus 1/3. The 600 was a lot better. The worst one they ever built was the Rover 800 Coupe. But again, I would love a Rover 800 Coupe today. You know, 827 Vitesse, I think they're really nice cars. But yeah, they were pretty shonky. Then came BMW. I watched a documentary on the acquisition, and I don't know if it's still on YouTube, and I thought it was wonderful. You can do a lot of damage with the edits. I'm hoping you're going to be nice to me today, James, with the rubbish I've come out with today. And it was a fly-in-the-wall thing about apprentices, and they'd taken some young German apprentices and they'd put them in Longbridge, I think it was, or it might have been Cowley, I think it was Longbridge, at Rover, and they were comparing the two, and it was lunch break. And the camera's focusing on 2 tables. Now, the engineers were supposed to mix the English and the German, so they learn from one another and they build a good team. But in reality, when people struggle with a foreign language, they tend to sit with their own. So you ended up with a table of young Germans, a table of young Brits. At the young Germans, at Longbridge, after BMW had bought them, they were talking about, I think it was tolerances. They were talking about tolerances of something. Oh, if we make it this, we can make it better. And yes, but we can change this, or we have to change the drawing, and then we have to change the quality plan. And they were really into it. Then they switched the table full of Brummies, and the Brummie said, "What's for pudding?" And that summed it up for me. And it was cruel editing, because no doubt there were some very competent Brits there too. But that tiny little snapshot for me was like a microcosm of everything that was going to go wrong and did go wrong. I think they were tooling up for the 75, and then it all got switched, and they were told to make the Mini, the new Mini, which sounds weird now because that was like 20 odd years ago, something, when they came out. So it's an old car now. And it was very exciting. And I was there when the production started. So they have like a pre-production run where they run at a slow pace and they assemble stuff and they make sure that all the tooling and the fixtures and everything all works as it should. And that the workers kind of handpicked and they're taking their time and they're doing the job because they need to ramp up for volume production. And somebody, here's the disclaimer. So the story goes, allegedly, supposedly, I was there, they lost a finger. They got a finger caught in a tool and it took their finger off. And I don't think that finger was found. There was such a hullabaloo and everybody was there from BMW. And it's like, what's happening? Nothing to see here. And so I think it's quite likely, quite possible, shall we say, that there is an early BMW Mini out there with some worker's finger in it somewhere, which is, I'm glad it's not mine and I'm sorry for the person that lost their finger, but those working practices still showed that there was a disparity between the expectations of management and a wonderfully thought out plan and the reality of blokes on the ground that are used to smashing together Rover 800s with buddleias growing beneath their feet. So I love all of that stuff. I absolutely love it. I have no idea what happened to the worker or their finger, but if somebody's out there with a Mini with a finger in it, then let us know. I went all over the world. I was very fortunate with it. I went to the US and I watched when they made the first sort of civilian version of the Hummer. And there were people putting that together that couldn't read or write, which struck me as being very, very odd. You know, you're supposed to follow instructions and so on. And then China. And then it kind of came to an end because my kids were growing up. I was kind of like a firework. I kind of raced through this world, talking quickly, working quickly, pestering people, doing stuff. And I went to China and I did some work at a place and there were, I don't know why, but there were people working there that had no shoes on and it bothered me. I didn't like that. And I was working at a place, and it's quite common in China, so working in a sort of big factory compound with a big fence around it. And I was there for a week or so, and I like to take a walk at lunch, just take a walk and then you see what's really going on. There's people around the back having a smoke and stuff going on. And then the other side of the fence, somebody had built a house out of pallets with a tarpaulin over the top of it. And this was near Shenzhen, which is like quite a popular, industrialised, you know, pretty wealthy part of China now. But back then it wasn't so great. And I thought there was something odd with this, and I couldn't quite work it out. There was a woman there, and she waved at me, and I waved back, and that was sort of it, sort of through the fence. And then the last day I was there, I heard a baby crying, and she'd given birth in this thing. And as a father of three kids, it really struck me, and I felt quite odd and awkward with the world. I felt, not that I was gloating in any way, but I felt a long way from the Midlands and from my cleaning petrol station bogs career suddenly seemed like a million miles away, and I didn't feel too good about it. And I think there's something about being a parent that gives you that humility or that sensitive touch that perhaps those who don't have kids don't have. Maybe, I don't know if I'm overthinking that or not, but I thought, yeah, this has probably got to end now. I kind of need to do something else. So then it was sort of the days of the internet, and I saw a Scandinavian company doing something quite unusual with measurement, and they had a web page, and this was back when, like, makes me sound so old, and I'm not that old, but they had a web page with all this interesting tech on it, and they were advertising for a job. So I rang them and like, hello, do you speak English? Yes, I want to apply for your job. So I flew up there, I had a job interview, and they offered me the job on the spot, and I ended up working for a Scandinavian company doing something quite different in oil and gas, and that's a different story and a different world, but the same kind of measurements in a different environment. I bought some interesting cars, yeah, I did. I mean, I've had all sorts. I think I mentioned that like a Porsche 968, which I absolutely loved, the Elise, which I've got. But aside from that, and I had a string of BMWs. I really like the way they drive, that rear-wheel drive thing, not interfering with the steering. I've got a big thing about steering. Is this strange? But that's the one thing I think, the single thing, is the difference between a good car and a bad car is the steering. And now, weirdly, as we move to EVs and things with, most cars now got electric steering, there's something odd in it I don't like, I don't feel, but BMW's always felt I had a great steering. So I had an E30, I had an E30, an E46, I had an E34, which I sold when one of my kids honked up in it, and she'd had an egg sandwich and it got into the upholstery, and I really didn't want to sell it. It was a beautiful car, BBS alloys, 525 manual E34, beautiful thing, in that red that always went chalky because the sun got in the paint. And to my shame, I'm sorry to whoever bought it, but I sold it in the depths of winter because it was cold, because when the car heated up, you got that eggy sick smell. so that had to go. I had quite a few BMWs. They're always very, very nice cars. And I had some interesting ones too. I then bought one or two quite hot cars and started to do track days, and thought that I think whether it's midlife crisis or what, but started to enjoy track days. And as quickly as I enjoyed doing track days, I got fed up with them, because it inevitably meant driving around in the circle, in the rain. Why is it always rain on track days? With cones, and like cones are synonymous with misery and order to me. Because I'd been traveling a lot with work, I got the bug for visiting interesting places. So I started to seek out historic motorsport routes. So, like the old Reims Formula One circuit near Goo, if I pronounce that correctly. It's fabulous. It's public roads. There's a taste of history, the old grandstand, and I love doing it. So, for the same price as a track day, like £200-300 or whatever it might be, I would take a budget flight. I would rent the cheapest car that I could. I'd tick all the insurance excess boxes and basically go and race around historic motorsport routes. And it got to the stage where I was doing almost like one a month. So it was ridiculous. It sort of started with doing Stelvio and ended up doing all manner of, like, finding the Sudschleife near the ring and learning these stories and meeting the people. And a magazine got into it. In fact, I can talk about it. It's Practical Performance Car magazine, which is another one that went to the wall recently as the death of print, sadly. And the guy said, you could tell quite a good story. And I realised that magazines would pay for these stories. And I used that money to then sort of fund more adventures and more travels. I then had an email from an American media company. And I'm quite sweary, and I thought they were trying to spam me. So they said, have you ever thought about video? And I thought they were trying to sell me some kit. So I just put, oh, fuck off and leave me alone. Spam, delete, block, done. And I thought no more of it. And a couple of weeks later, I had a phone call, and somebody had tracked me down, which is not always easy considering I use a nom de plume. And they said, oh, I'm so-and-so, and you told me to F off in an email. I said, oh, bloody hell, you're a real person. I'm so sorry. And they asked me if I wanted to start making films. So I made some short films for Motors TV and one or two with us, and I ended up doing stuff for CBS and X-Car and Carfection and so on. And I really enjoyed it. And it was, even now, at my age, it's only ever a hobby to do these things. I feel very self-conscious talking about this. I think because I've got my dad's voice from my dad that paints things, saying, well, that's a load of bloody rubbish, or that never happened, or I'm bored, shut up. And so I still have that fear. But I wrote a feature called Lotus versus Last Orders. So the pub we were in last night, and the reason I'm slightly hungover today, I was there with a mate. We had an Elise Club Racer in that lovely baby blue, fantastic car. And we tried to buy some champagne, and this was on a Saturday morning, I forget what time, in the Midlands. And they said, we don't have any. And I said, well, we got chatting. So what are we going to do with this car today? Sun's shining. What do we do? So I said, tell you what, let's see if we can let's go and buy some champagne and see if we can back before last orders. But we drove to Reims. We drove to Champagne. We went to one of the champagne houses. We bought like a Methuselah or a Jeroboam or something, a huge bottle of champagne in a case, and back before the pub closed. So my favourite things, France, champagne, Lotuses, charging around, and pointless challenges. And that was great fun. And I wrote that story up, and Al Goy read it and said, do you want to help make some films? And I started then with X-Car, which was the forerunner to that. And they came in along on a day when I was doing two things, because I've got some interesting friends and fortunate enough to do some silly stuff. And I'm a big believer in that. It's easier to ask forgiveness than permission. So we did two things in a day. I'd got a Tiger at the time, which is like a poor man's Caterham kit car made out in the fens. And I'd had a bet with a speedway rider that I was quicker than him. We went to a speedway venue, and I raced this guy, and I can't remember his name now, but he spanked me, as you'd expect, because I can't drive for toffee. He's a world-class speedway rider, and we raced around a circuit. So I did that in the morning. X-Car sent a crew along to film it. And in the afternoon, I had a friend who'd built a replica of a Maserati 250F, a beautiful six-cylinder single-seat race car from way back. And I have another friend who owns a biplane, and we were going to do some barnstorming. I paid, this is absolutely true, the runway, it's not an active runway, but it's an active site. And I said to the security guard, what do you want to just bugger off and leave us alone whilst we do something dodgy for a day? And quick as a flash, he said 12 bacon sandwiches. And he was a morbidly obese bloke in a high vis. And he specified the ketchup. So I went to a local deli butcher's place, bought a dozen bacon sandwiches, and I said, there you go, don't look, go away. And we raced a Tiger Moth biplane against a Maserati 250F replica, and it was the most fun I've ever had. The pilot, we're way off topic with where this started now. The pilot is a friend of mine. In his head, he's kind of a cross between Lord Flashheart and Biggles, but in reality, he's probably more like an alcoholic baldric, I would say. He's going to batter me when he watches this. And he once had a warning from the police. He lives in Nottinghamshire. And early aircraft, when they dropped bombs, they didn't have racks. They were literally throwing grenades and bombs over the side. So you'd fly around, spot the enemy and drop a thing over the side. And he wanted to practice. And there used to be a thing called flour bombing, where you take a bag of flour, you fly over an airfield, and you throw the flour and it would explode, it would look great. So he sort of had this in his mind. So he went to a sports shop and bought a sack of tennis balls, took off in the plane. And Tiger Moth's two-seater, but normally there's only one of you in it. So he took off and he was aiming at the local church spire. So he would fly around the church spire, throwing tennis balls at the church spire for fun. And he did this twice. And eventually the vicar complained to the police, and the police came around and said, are you Mr. X? He said, yes, I am. So would you please stop bombing the church with tennis balls? So yeah, I'm very fortunate to have met some interesting people that have allowed these things to happen, and that sort of got me into the groove. I found, and still find, making films a bit odd. So we did some of the early Carfection stuff were very, very X-Class, were very understanding. And bear in mind that this isn't my job. I just do this for fun. I write the stories, write the books, do the things. I just do it for fun because it's an outlet. But we did the story of Paddy Hopkirk and the Minis and Monaco and what have you. And it's one of the very first things I did. And I hope to God you don't watch it. A, because you should be watching JAYEMM's channel. And B, because it's bloody awful. I was pre-Moustache back then. We went down to Calder Torini in a Mini, and we were filming. I'd never been on camera before. And as we were filming, it's the middle of nowhere, some local French council workers spotted what we were doing and started heckling us. So it's quite awkward. It's me and my mate, Daryl, and we're being filmed. There's a couple of crew. And behind the camera is this French workman, and he's looking at me going, all right, which is quite funny, but he didn't go away. He stood there for about 2 hours as I'm trying to do a piece to camera, and I can't remember my own bloody name, let alone a script. And he literally stood there going, for hours. I thought, do I punch him? Do I tell him to clear off? Or does he want me to perform an indecent act upon him, or what? And it was really, really difficult. And if there are many reasons why that's a wonky film, and they're all on me, but mainly it's because I was bothered. But I've quite enjoyed doing stuff for X-Car, which then, of course, became Carfection, which then eventually it dried up. New owners, no longer CBS, and that all stopped. And Henry went on to do stuff with Hegarty and others, and Al's doing wonderful stuff, and I watch all of his content, which is great. But it was fun while it lasted, and that's how I see all of these things. They're always fun while they last, and you have to do it. The moustache, I got a lot of comments. I used to get a lot of comments about the moustache, which is awkward and puby and wonky and horrible. But yeah, my kids hate the moustache, which is one of the reasons I kept it. But I grew it for the Goodwood revival, and I had a Jag for a while. Actually, I have a friend in Oslo, and he was complaining about the cost of spares, and obviously everything in Norway is mind-warpingly expensive. And he had an XJ6 Jag, so mid-90s Jag, my kind of car. And the aircon pump went, and the dealer in Oslo wanted the equivalent of 1,500 quid for the aircon pump. And my mate said, can you get me one in the UK? I said, yeah, sure. And they said, you can buy an entire Jag XJ6 for 1,500 quid, right? So a few years ago, but still, I think they're undervalued, those things. So he said, great. He said, I'll send you 1,500 quid. You buy me an XJ6. It can be in any state as long as the aircon works. So on eBay, there was a pirate DJ in Grantham. who'd always wanted one, who'd bought one and got bored of it, and flogged it to me for, I can't remember, 1,200 quid, something like that. My mate wired me the money and some fuel money, and I drove it from Grantham to Tonsberg, which is just south of Oslo, in February. You used to be able to take a ferry from Immingham, Hull somewhere up to Norway, and I think it still runs as a freight ferry, but basically to get to Norway you're going to have to drive there. So me and a couple of mates, we decided to drive this Jag all the way up to Oslo in February. Now, in much of continental Europe it's illegal to drive on all year summer tyres, and this was on awful Chinese rebrand death trap tyres, and it was so funny. And I remember driving through Denmark, just full lock, just sort of fishtailing happily up the motorway. Bjorn, my mate there, he's been a mate for life, and we've had quite some scrapes, but I think driving a manky old Jag up there was quite a highlight. So yeah, I grew the moustache because I went to the Goodwood Revival, and of course I had the Jag for a bit, and I thought that was all good, and my kids absolutely hate it, which makes me want to keep it even more, because one of the few pleasures, I think, of being a parent, one of the greatest pleasures, one of the many pleasures, is just being able to humiliate and embarrass your kids in public. So that's the reason. If they ever say, "Dad, I really like it, it suits you," then I think it'll come off. And that got me into really historic motorsport and the realisation that modern cars and making cars, to me, held less and less of an appeal. And the older I get, the more I like looking backwards at stuff. So coming here, this Stonehurst Farm Park was owned by sort of family friends, and it's full of stuff that I don't know. So I'm sitting here and I think that's an Austin, but I don't actually know. And maybe we'll get some footage of some of the bits and bobs later. But the older the stuff gets, it's like a window into looking how things were done differently. And it's all very, very mechanical. And this fabulous old bus, 1906, was used as a school bus and then for delivering tyres, and it lived down in London, and now it's up here. And the story of it and the workmanship, and I find that more interesting than the latest, EVs and stuff. And that's all great, but that doesn't really push my buttons. And I got from there, I launched with a mate of mine a publication called Motorpunk. So we had a magazine that lasted a year until we ran out of money, and I'm surprised it lasted that long. Where you write for magazines and you'd earn a commission and you think there's a life to be made from doing it. In reality, when you sit the other side of the spreadsheet looking at the balance of accounts, you realise that how the hell does anybody make any money from print? But we had a tremendous year, and I'm so grateful to friends that helped make that happen. And we ran a quarterly magazine. And we talked about the things I've mentioned in this chat, road tripping, going up to Iceland, for example, because just the scenery is ridiculous, and learning to drive in stupid places, and championing shonky rubbish like the Mini Moke and Lancia Gammas and all of this weird stuff. So I wanted to talk about all these horrible homeless things that didn't have a home, and we made that Motorpunk. And the origin of the word punk is basically DIY. You make it yourself, you bodge it, you make and make do. So that was the reason for that Motorpunk, which was really good. And we still do bits and bobs, and it's got quite a big following. The website's got quite a big following online. And so if anybody likes the drivel I've come out with today, there's a number of us, Darryl and Stephen, others that upload content. It's free to read. And basically it's daft stuff that nobody in print will commission, but we still think it's worth sharing with the world. One thing I'd always wanted to do, and I'd read about a race series in the US called the 24 Hour of Lemons, and this is obviously a parody of the Le Mans race series, but it's done for sub $500 cars. And I'd done a few banger rallies. I had the Scumball Rally and others, and I'd really loved all of that stuff. Just shonky cars doing silly things is so much more fun. When you have no expectations of a car, when you think it's going to be rubbish and it gets you there and it's warm and it's safe, then it's great. I drove a Metro to the Sahara Desert just because I grew up being told that Rover stuff was junk, and I wanted to prove that it wasn't. And that was great. I drove a Metro all the way to the desert, swapped it for a piece of cheesecake and flew home. And I love all that. And I saw this race series in the US called 24 Hours of Lemons. And there's like 24 races a year. It's a proper race series. This isn't just a one-off banger rally thing. This is proper racing, but for mental people. And I put myself firmly in that category. So last year I went and raced in a Class A car, which Class A drugs I think are needed to make the damn thing get anywhere. So we raced for 24 hours at New Hampshire Motor Speedway, and I loved it. It was a Miata, which is quite a sensible car. So Lemons has a wonderful series of penalties, whereas if your car is too good, they hit you with a number of penalty laps. So of course in endurance racing it's how far you go over a 24-hour period. Some cars were given a 100-lap penalty, a 500-lap penalty, and so on. And then you have different categories. So Class A is for cars with a chance of winning, I think it is. And Class B is for cars with a chance of finishing. And Class C is for cars with a chance of starting. So Class C had, my favourite car there was a Lancia Scorpion, which is a US spec Lancia Beta Monte Carlo, which, beautiful thing, I love it. Everyone's going to be angry when I say this, but they're awfully unreliable. But that ran and won its class and was a great car. Because Lemons hates Miatas, MX-5s, because they are reliable, we got lumped in with all the hardcore stuff. So we came, I think, 70-something out of 150-odd cars, and we won Judge's Choice. They couldn't quite believe that we'd travelled from halfway around the world to drive a very, very poorly battered MX-5 in a race. And we sung God Save the King, which is weird to sing that now, isn't it, instead of God Save the Queen, and basically got abused and bottled off and upset a lot of people for calling them colonials, and made some tremendous friends and had a great time. So that's my latest thing. I'm kind of hooked on that, and we should do some more Lemons racing in 2023. I think the older I get, the more I realise that it's the people that are important, not necessarily the machinery, and how little I know about anything. I'm very fortunate to have done some cool things, but really I don't know anything. And the more I travel and the more people I meet, the more appetite I've got for seeing and doing new things and travelling further and doing madder stuff. We all have this love and we all come at it from different directions, but that love of cars is what sort of unites us, and racing old rubbish and laughing at the fact that in Lemons, if you overtake under yellows, they pull you in, they'll black flag you, and you have to record a dating video before they let you out on track again, or they'll weld a steel pig to the roof of your car, or you have to carve a pumpkin or take a selfie with a dog. And it's like the antithesis of sort of po-faced, you know. I remember, I mean, I'm quite into Formula One, and I remember when Rosberg and Hamilton were fighting for the title, and Rosberg clipped Lewis at, I think it was at Spa, wasn't it? It was at Spa. And over the radio, Lewis said, "Nico, hit me." And you think, and I'm a big Lewis fan, but it's a bit like, teacher, he did that. And I thought, oh, come on, you know, you're just driving around in circles. That it doesn't really mean anything. And then you go to Lemons, where you might do something slightly silly, and suddenly they'll paint you up as Marcel Marceau, and you have to mime what you did wrong, and then like apologise to them before they let you back in the car. And you think, I love these people, and I love this kind of racing, and I really want to do more of it. So, yeah, that's what I'm up to. Well, I can't believe I'm admitting any of this, but that's what I'm up to lately, and it's great fun. Now it's time to plug the shit out of these books. I've been a big fan over the years of Sniff Petrol and Richard Porter. And Richard Porter said that this book was hilarious. So this is Confessions from Quality Control. It's very thin, and the reason it's thin is that there was a nervousness that people wouldn't find these stories interesting. So I kind of raced to the punchline. So it's available on Amazon, Confessions from Quality Control. And a lot of what I've said is in here, and there's an awful lot more. Like, there's a picture of Noel Edmonds cutting a cake, and Noel Edmonds once called me a twat at Goodwood, of which I'm immensely proud. If I ever have a CV to get a proper job, that's going on it. And Richard Porter said of this one, I haven't read this book, but his last one was good, so, you know, take your chances and buy it, which I thought was quite good. So this is Nothing Handles Like a Rental Car, and this is actually quite a chunky book. This tells the story of how once a month I would rent a car, I would tick the insurance excess box, and I would go and race around some beautiful old motorsport venues. Like, I can't believe I'm saying this, I broke into Zandvoort, for example, and did 10 laps before they stopped me. Which was quite exciting, and other silly things such as that, and basically a kind of a how-to guide. And it was like how to enjoy motorsport on the cheap. And again, I had a lot of fun. I got blacklisted by Hertz for that when they twigged who I was. What I've also done over the years is I would leave a copy of this book in the footwell where the spare is. So once that rental car goes to auction and somebody buys it, they will find there is a photograph of, and they're all fairly mundane stuff. You know, there's some fairly ordinary machinery in here. But yeah, they may well find their thing is featured. And I kind of justified this on, so yeah, that's the Col de Cayolle in a Peugeot 207. Yeah, I think that was the story that got me banned by Hertz. But you know, you tick the insurance excess box, some risk assessor somewhere is working on the basis this car is going to be worth X as stock, as an asset, and so on. So I kind of figured they've had their money out of me. I'm sure that's going to upset a lot of people. But I would say two things. Never buy an ex-rental car, and I would also never buy an ex-press car, ever buy an ex-press car, and you'll see why if you read Nothing Handles Like a Rental Car. I feel terrible plugging these books. I'm sure nobody's going to read them, but if you do, thank you very much, and it helps to fund further adventures.
There we have it. Did you enjoy that? I hope so. If you did, don't forget, comment down below, hit the like button, share it with your friends, and if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe. We'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.